I was saying how you should all become a member of Stop the War. We've got the first plenary festival, and after that we're going into a short 15-minute break. Then we've got some really excellent breakout sessions. We'll be talking about Britain's role in the Middle East, space wars and artificial intelligence, war and the climate crisis, and others to choose from as well. So I really hope that you all stick around for the next few hours of this conference. But without further ado, let's get cracking. While we're hearing from the next few speakers in this plenary, if you've got any questions or comments, please send them into the chat. You can send them to me or one of my colleagues who are the host of this event, and we'll get through as many comments and questions while speakers, in between speakers, as we can, rather than doing a roundup at the end. So kicking off this opening plenary is one of Stop the War's founders, a writer, activist, and of course our convener, Lindsey German. And hopefully Lindsey can now be unmuted as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Shelley, and thanks everybody for coming to the conference. I didn't think I could start the conference without talking about the defeat for Western imperialism that is just is happening in Afghanistan, because the announcement by Biden that he is pulling the troops out after 20 years on the anniversary of September the 11th. This is something that American presidents have said before, but it is obvious that this time they know that they cannot continue there. They know they're not going to win. And the British military have expressed displeasure at this, because obviously this was a decision made by the United States on its own. And I suppose we shouldn't be surprised at this. After all, the military commander of NATO is always from the United States, and now we know why, because they make all the key decisions over these things. And I think it's just worth saying, first of all, that this is a war that many of us on this panel and many other people said 20 years ago was a war that would not decrease terrorism, would not improve the lives of the Afghan people, would not do anything to bring peace to the world. We condemned the events of 9/11, but we said that actually the answer to the events of 9/11 was not war, and that we had to look for other alternatives to that. We have been proved absolutely right, but at a huge cost of more than 100,000 Afghans dead, of nearly 500 British soldiers dead, of several thousand American soldiers dead. This has been a war it was a war which was a completely pointless war, and one which should never have started in the first place. And if you remember why it started because they wanted to go into Iraq after 9/11, but they couldn't do that straight away. So that was a war which took place straight away at the instigation of George Bush, followed by Tony Blair, as so often with all these things. And it was a war which was about defending all the worst imperialist values. And I think we should all see this withdrawal of troops as a victory for anti-war campaigning, for the anti-war movement. But I think at the same time, we should have absolutely no illusions in what Biden is doing, because this was an unwinnable war, but it hasn't put them off wars in the slightest. In fact, what we've had in the Biden administration is we've got sanctions and rhetoric against China. We have sanctions and rhetoric against Russia. Only this week, the expulsion of Russian diplomats. We've got a situation where he's reversed the planned withdrawal of US troops from Germany, and therefore this is about bolstering NATO in Eastern Europe in particular, in conflict with Russia. He's been engaged in military exercises in the Indo-Pacific, and we know we're going to see far, far more of those. So I think we're talking about the world at a very dangerous point 20 years on from the beginning of the war on terror. And if this is true about the United States, it of course is also true about Britain. And if you look at Johnson and his plans for what he wants to do militarily, and what he wants to do with Britain's role in the world, as he calls it, and his plans are very much seeing Russia as the UK's #1 threat. So we can see all the ramping up of again, the rhetoric and the perceived conflict with Russia, which is not just a an abstract or a long-term question. This is a question where we, as we know, at the moment there's much talk about conflict in the Ukraine or over the Ukraine because the Russians troops are near their own borders and near the border with Ukraine. The British media and the British government don't, of course, talk about the repeated exercises and troop movements involved on the other side of Russia's borders with, for example, the Baltic states. And this is something we've seen NATO expansion over the last decades, and we've seen the impact this is having on the possibilities of conflict in Eastern Europe with Russia. And therefore, you know, Ukraine is now becoming much more of a flashpoint and something that we need to be very aware of and be aware about campaigning on it. We also see that Johnson has increased military spending far above the level of inflation. That's already factored in. But in addition to that, he's also talking about a much bigger increase in military spending, an extra £16 billion. Now, all of this adds up to an approach which is increasingly militaristic, which, far from learning the lessons of the last 20 years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya and elsewhere, and we're still embroiled in all sorts of conflict in the Middle East, not least, of course, with the war on Yemen. It's also a sign in terms of what Johnson wants to do, because we've long talked about the special relationship with the United States, and that is something that the British obviously are very keen on maintaining. But we're also looking at a situation where, in a way, this is a very difficult time for British imperialism. It's been in long-term decline. It's in a very weak position. The fact that it now is no longer in the European Union means that in lots of ways it is floundering around for a role and cannot find the role that it wants to play. It's thrashing around in all sorts of ways. What is its response to that? What is the Johnson government's response to that? It is this increase in military spending. It is the increase in tensions with Russia and with China, obviously, although they've highlighted Russia as the immediate threat, but also with China as well. It's a time when they are reverting to the use of the flag. You know, the schools near me, you now have the Union Jack is flown from flagpoles in the front of the schools in inner city London, which is something that we've never seen before. People will be aware that if you watch any broadcast by ministers, and indeed, unfortunately, by Labour shadow cabinet ministers as well, you see the Union Jack in every single photo of these people. They're using this nationalism and using the flag in the most obvious way. And I think we need to also look at what this means in terms of aspects of life here, not just in terms of the military spending, which is instead of spending on the nurses, or instead of spending on education or on housing or all the other things we'd like to see it being spent on. But we're also, when we founded Stop the War, we said there were two other issues that we were concerned about. One was the growth of racism, Islamophobia in particular, as a result of the war on terror. And we have seen this very sharply, not just in Britain, internationally, but we've seen it in Britain over the last 20 years, the growth of this kind of racism, and generally the kind of racist ideology over migrants, over asylum seekers, over all those sorts of issues. We also said in 2001 that we wanted to campaign in defence against racism and in defence of civil liberties. And what we're seeing now with the newest laws, both the way in which the lockdown has been used by police to try and suppress demonstrations, but also with the new laws which are now going through Parliament, which are not only are racist laws against the Gypsy, traveller and Roma communities, but also a serious attack on the right to protest, a serious attack on people like ourselves who are campaigning and demonstrating around all these issues. So all these issues, I think, have to be brought together. And I'm very pleased we're having the conference today where we'll be discussing the whole question of Britain's foreign policy, its relationship to the United States, its relationship to the rest of the world. But I also think as part of that discussion, and we will be discussing this later on, we have to assert our right to protest and our opposition to racism as well, because these are part of the package that has done so much damage over the last 2 decades with the war on terror. It is something that war, far from being removed from the horizon, we know the possibility of the increased threat of war with Russia and obviously with China as well are very, very real threats, and we have to make sure we campaign. The importance of us campaigning has never been greater, and we have to keep doing this on all of these levels in order to defeat the military approach of this government and to defeat these domestic policies which do so much harm to the rest of us as well.
Thank you, Lindsey. Great setting the scene now. I now turn to our next speaker, who is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, to address us, Kate Hudson.
Okay, thanks. I was saying, can you unmute me? Because it wasn't letting me unmute myself. Okay, thanks very much, Shelley. Thanks, Lindsey, for that introduction. And thanks to Stop the War for organising this conference. It really couldn't be more timely. And I think our conclusions today and our thoughts about action going forward, I think is going to be really important. And I just want to say a few words about this whole question of global Britain and its global role. And what does that actually mean? Because it's like something that Johnson's been saying over and over again over the past few years. It's never been quite clear what it means. Does it just mean the flags, like Lindsey was just talking about? And the whole question of revisiting the imperial project, you know, that's the overtones and the undertones of the whole thing. But I think if we were in any doubt about what it was, that's now been spelt out very clearly. I think it basically means Britain on the attack. And if you want to read the nuts and bolts of it, can I point you in the direction of the so-called integrated review, which the government published last month. And this is the first time the government has put together security, defence, development and foreign policy all in the same pot and kind of shaken it up. And it very clearly projects and promotes a post-Brexit global Britain that is on the offensive. I mean, that is what it is all about. It's all about projecting force globally. To quote from it, Britain is ready to deter and defeat if necessary. And to my mind, it's straight out of the US playbook. There's much that's reminiscent of the strategies and postures of the former Trump administration. You know, there's a lot of continuity there. It talks of defending democracy against systemic competition, shaping a new open international order. So very much the US narrative. It also talks about Britain being Western Europe's most heavily armed nation. It really celebrates that, you know, and as Lindsey was saying, you know, the increase in defence spending way above what's required technically in terms of inflation and so on. And it also situates Britain very firmly as the US's junior partner. That's a clear message throughout. So again, that special relationship is being reinforced. There is a strategic shift in the document over where we've been at before. That lies in the focus on the Indo-Pacific region. They describe it as a tilt, so it's the Indo-Pacific tilt. This includes the Indian Ocean and its two key powers, India and Australia, along with the UK, Japan and others, as a network of regional allies against China. And this anti-China thing comes through very clearly. Those of you who are familiar with US foreign policy, you'll know about the Quad approach, which is a similar kind of thing. And we're also now seeing this kind of regional alliance against China being mirrored by NATO in its new policy direction as well. So while Russia is described as the most acute threat, and Lindsey was just talking about some of the areas in which that's been developed, China is clearly the main strategic focus. Now, one of the areas in this which was completely unexpected and got a lot of headlines, thank goodness, was the most, really shocking and disgraceful elements. And that was that there was an announcement that Britain's nuclear arsenal is going to be increased by 40%. So we're going to go from a nuclear weapons stockpile, which is around about 200, which can kill hundreds of millions of people already. They're going to increase it to 260. I mean, what? Anyway, so that completely goes against the trend that has been present in UK strategic thinking since the end of the Cold War. There's been a gradual decline. And it also goes against the trend by Biden and Putin. One of the first things that they did when Biden came into office was to renew the so-called New START treaty, which is a kind of bilateral reductions treaty between those two countries. So it's like people are going in, most countries are going one direction, and then it's Boris Johnson is like unilaterally starting a new nuclear arms race. I mean, really, you couldn't make it up. But it's not only the numbers of the warheads, which is a big concern. There's also a change in Britain's nuclear use posture. You may have thought that we have them in order not to use them. That's what the government always says, oh, we're not going to use them. But actually, they do talk about circumstances in which they would use nuclear weapons. And in this document, it says Britain now reserves the right to use nuclear weapons, not only against nuclear threats, but against supposedly comparable threats, such as chemical and biological weapons or so-called emerging technologies. I mean, what is that? Is that how can you nuke a cyber attack? Just complete craziness. So that is all of great concern, and obviously C&D is really stepping up the pressure around this. One of the other things that's mentioned again, you probably remember from last autumn, and we've talked about it since, the deployment of the aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier that's going to head off to the South China Sea via the Mediterranean and Middle East. That was announced last autumn, but that's repeated again, and that is due to set off next month, and it's described as the UK's most ambitious global deployment for 2 decades. So what's not in the review? Well, most things seem to be in it. There's new combat planes, predator drones, expansion of military activities, a national cyber force with attack capability, a new artificial intelligence centre, RAF Space Command. Did you know we're going to be launching our first rockets next year? So, there's so much military hardware coming on stream. And of course, it's going to be a field day for the big weapons companies. And just after they published this review, they published their new defence and security industrial strategy. It basically reads like an advertisement for the arms trade. So there's more money for military spending, a stronger emphasis on onshore production, and increased jobs in the sector is very much stressed. And it makes it sound as though the vision of post-Brexit global Britain is one of an economy based on weapons productions and sales. That's our economy post-Brexit. So I think that as a movement, we have to be really tough on this. We have to really push for defence diversification. And this is where the trade unions also need to step up and fight for jobs that meet the needs of our society, not jobs that produce weapons of mass destruction or profits from the production of the tools of death and repression. I mean, we've seen what this is doing in Yemen and elsewhere. There's got to be a change in the movement on this. So we know, Shelley, we know what global Britain actually means. It's nuclear rearmament, dangerous military expansionism, and a significant strategic reorientation, joining the US and NATO in hostility towards China. So to conclude, there are many ways in which our movement can be active on this. Not only to oppose these developments, we have to have the goal of reversing them. And that's certainly the case with C&D's approach to the nuclear weapons. We've got to reverse that. And we've got a lot of opportunities coming up. C&D and Stop the War are working together to build opposition to the aircraft carrier strike group, which I've just mentioned, going to the South China Sea. We're working on organising a counter summit to NATO's next Heads of State summit. That's supposed to be coming up in Brussels in June this year. And then, of course, there's also the G7 taking place in Cornwall in June. We're mobilising opposition for that as well. So last but not least, we're also organising a peace and anti-war bloc on the People's Assembly March in London on the 26th of June. So I'm sure everyone's dying to get out there. It'll be safe and lovely and sunny and nice, I hope, on that day. So please come along and join us on our Nurses Not Nukes blog. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Kate. Loads of really important mobilisations coming up, and definitely a date for the diary, that one, 26th of June. And hopefully it's sunny, as you say, like it is here today. Just to let people know, this meeting's being recorded. And also, I said at the beginning, but I'll say it again in case you missed it, whether you were late or I was muted. It's so lovely to see everybody on my screen. More than 200 people we've got here today. A great way to spend a sunny day organising with Comrades for Peace. And just to let you know again, while we're hearing from the speakers, if you've got any questions, any comments that you want to make, please post them in the chat. You can send them to either me or one of the other hosts, and we'll go through those as we go along in this session rather than doing a roundup at the end. So please don't hold back, send them in now. Now, our next speaker is a writer, journalist, historian, filmmaker, activist, and of course, a friend and patron of Stop the War. It's a pleasure to introduce Tariq Ali. Any second now, Tariq. Should be on our screens and unmuted. There we go.
Okay, fine. What I want to stress is the combination of two things we're witnessing at the present time. Both have been stressed by the previous speakers. On the one hand, a level of defeats or severe setbacks for the American empire, and on the other hand, a renewed drive for militarization and solving global problems through military interventions. They're going together. They don't learn the lessons of one to stop the other. They're moving on. So soon, you know, in a few years' time, Afghanistan, what was that? Given the way in which historical memory is muted and conveyed on the mainstream media outlets. So let's see. Afghanistan was basically a war of revenge. They had to do something after 9/11. There was a huge debate within the National Security Council. Some members said, forget Afghanistan, let's go for Iraq now. i.e. Iraq, and dismantling that regime was on the agenda even before 9/11. This was vetoed on the grounds that people wouldn't understand why we've done this when Osama bin Laden and his group are essentially based in Afghanistan. That was the only motivation. We have to have a revenge strike where, and Afghanistan, unfortunately for its people, won out, and a war that had been going on for ages, first against the Russians, then against the Americans, just carried on. And the loss of civilian life in Afghanistan has been the highest in proportional global terms for the people of that country. And very little work has been done on building an infrastructure. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan foolishly and stupidly, which some of us oppose, they at least built an infrastructure. They built women's colleges, they had women flying planes. I mean, there was some progress. With this particular intervention by the United States, there's been nothing. So let's not moan now about, oh, what state are we leaving Afghanistan in? You had 20 bloody years to do something and you were incapable of doing it because it clashed clashed with your global perspectives on how to run the world and how to run your own country. That war, as Lindsey correctly pointed out, has failed. Secondly, the war in Yemen, which Obama green-lighted and which was backed and is being backed by Britain, has been lost. The Saudis thought they would have quick victories because they had, modern technological armies equipped by the West. They underestimated the Yemeni desire, not just of Shias, Sunnis, and many, many others who don't fit into either category, who didn't want to be occupied by the Saudis and the West. And attempts to impose governments in the Yemen failed. Had they not upped the ante in 2015, the Yemeni opposition would have won every city in that country. And they are, I think, now on the verge of doing so. So the West is screaming negotiations, the Yemenis won't negotiate, etc., etc. The Yemenis are saying, stop the sanctions, let us get food and medicines into the country, and then we're prepared to sit down at the table with you and negotiate your withdrawal from our country. That is what's happening in Yemen. Libya, as we pointed out, remains a total and complete mess, with different factions of Western imperialism backing different hardcore fundamentalist groups, which in other parts of the world they say they've gone to destroy. The destruction of Libya by the Americans and the British, backed by the EU powers, has left that country a total wreck. And the strategy of the empire and imperialism, the United States in particular, has been effectively to break countries up because they're then easier to rule, like they did in Yugoslavia. And then different European powers went for different parts of Yugoslavia as their protege states. I mean, the EU, most of the former Yugoslavia consists now of what we can only describe as EU colonies, politically, socially, economically. And that is what imperialism is trying to do globally. They failed in Afghanistan, with consequences which we can only imagine. They have failed in the Yemen, they failed in Iraq, and they failed in Syria at huge cost. Huge cost. All these wars could have been sorted out if the desire had been there for negotiated settlements. It hasn't happen. So these wars, I think, if we want to characterize them, these are wars to deprive countries of sovereignty. And to say that the only sovereignty that will be accepted is US sovereignty and that of its satellite states in Western Europe and a few in the Far East. I mean, there is a huge mass movement against the presence of American troops in Okinawa in Japan. But whenever a prime minister comes who vaguely mutters about perhaps the time has come to change the situation in Japan and foreign bases, an American president flies off to get rid of him. Obama did that to the predecessor of the guy now in power. They just go to remove elected politicians who don't do their bidding. You know, a sort of Jeremy Corbyn type thing, but with people already in power and already on their side. They will not tolerate dissent on this. Russia, China, it's the same problem. That the Russians, whatever you may think of their policies, have asserted their own sovereignty and defended their own national interests. I don't agree with many of the things they do, but they argue that they have the right, as a big power, to do as the Americans do. Why shouldn't they? Who are you to tell us what to do and what not to do when the example you're setting is very clear? And the Chinese at the Alaska summit, between the Chinese foreign minister and Blinken, gave as good as they got in verbal terms. Certainly they did. I mean, they told the Americans very clearly, China is long past the stage when we listen to homilies delivered by powers who can only talk because of their military superiority. We're not going to do it. We will not cave in. to you and your demands and your needs. So in this situation, the US doesn't know what to do. They'll try and destabilize China, impose sanctions against China, against Russia. The use of economic sanctions by the United States against countries which do not do their bidding has now reached amazing proportions. Do not underestimate that, and could lead to conflicts either directly or indirectly. The war in Azerbaijan, recently over Nagorno-Karabakh, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, was a local war backed by local states, but don't have any doubts as what was there in the background, a conflict between the West and Russia in different forms taking place there, just like in the period before the First World War. Lots of local conflicts. I'm not saying there will be a Third World War, but the situation being played is dangerous. Britain's role. Look, we should, not take government reports too seriously, because effectively Britain is not an independent state. All this nonsense Johnson talked about, once we're out of Europe, we'll be independent. Some of us criticized that at the time from the left, saying this is total nonsense, because you won't be independent, because you have accepted effectively, since the Suez debacle of 1956, you have accepted to be an American satellite state. That is what they used to call old Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union, satellite states. Britain today is a satellite state, a satrapy. Its politics, its military alliances are complete replicas of the United States. They want to increase nuclear spending, or spending on nuclear weapons and their nuclear arsenal, but they will not be allowed to use that without the permission of the State Department and the Pentagon. Have no doubt about that. There is no independence, which is why Corbyn and his sudden emergence pose such a threat, and why the state completely freaked out to have a leader of a political party in the House of Commons who wasn't a servant of the British security state, and beyond that, even more seriously, the United States. So British citizens, supporters of Stop the War, have to know what Britain is in order to be able to combat it. It's not Britain alone. It is what it is and the system into which it has happily inserted itself. It needn't have done this, but that is the direction in which they chose to go. And all the major political parties now in Parliament have accepted this. And the Scottish National Party in Scotland, while it has many good people in it, has also accepted membership of NATO permanently, and various other linked things. At least there's a debate in Scotland. In England, there's no debate apart from us and a few handful of members of Parliament. And so Stop the War remains a very crucial organization, the only one of its kind in the rest of Europe and North America. And I'm very proud of that those of us who set it up and have remained active, and the new younger generations who have come in and joined the movement, big or small, and it varies, but its importance shouldn't be doubted. It is a thorn in the side of the British establishment, which is all sorts of slanders reply. You oppose a war and you're a stooge of the government in power which is being victimized. Just complete nonsense. They couldn't do that in Iraq because the opposition to Blair's war was too strong. They've succeeded to a certain extent in Syria, playing on the confusions and demoralizations of certain people on the left, some of whom, I hate to say this, would be very happy for an imperialist takeover of Damascus and a pro-Western government. They think that'll be the road forward. Listen to the bells tolling in Kabul. Listen to that. All these arguments were used against, by those who supported the war in Afghanistan. All of them were used. We opposed them. So we opposed them in Afghanistan, we opposed them in Syria, we opposed them in Yemen, and we opposed them in all the countries that are occupied. But in order to carry on opposing them, it is extremely important that we carry on recruiting to our own ranks, because soon Stop the War and its allied organizations, the way it's going, will be the only real opposition in this country, unless Corbyn launches Peace and Freedom as an independent organization, not just online, and takes on the Labour Party leadership, because without doing that, he might no longer be an MP, which would be a tragedy. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Tariq. And I think a really important message there at the end, that people need to join. We need to build Stop the War and build our ranks. I'm going to read out a few comments and questions that have come through on the chat to me. Laura asks, I'm wondering whether someone could say a little more about what the trade unions for workers within the arms trade could do and what their reluctance has been thus far, following on from Kate's speech. Gary asks, what is the plan B if the June the 26th demo is not allowed? Quite an interesting question after what Lindsey was saying about the need for us to be part of the Kill the Bill campaign and the need to resist further efforts to criminalise protest. And Andre says, I'm not British and I'm wondering, would it not be better to reclaim the British flag under the agenda of Britain in peace? I do not know of other countries who are as ashamed of their flags. There are some interesting comments coming through. Don't forget, the breakout sessions that we'll do after this are your chance to get involved in the conversation on issues around racism, the arms trade, and all these things. So do take your questions to those sessions as well to help ignite some really interesting discussion. Next, we'll be hearing from writer and academic. He's a professor in the Department of Peace Studies at Bradford University and columnist on global security for Open Democracy. Paul Rodgers, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Shelley, and thank you very much for inviting me here this afternoon. I really want to just have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the themes that have been so well developed by Kate and Lindsey and Tariq. Because so much is happening at present that I think we need to sort of stand back and get a bit of a grip on it. I want to look actually at one or two things that have happened on the other side of the Atlantic, because in a way they're quite intriguing. If you go back, what, nearly 30 years, Clinton, when he came in 1992, he appointed as director of the Central Intelligence Agency a guy called James Woolsey. And Woolsey was asked at Senate hearings how he would describe the collapse of the old order, the Soviet Union gone. And he said, I put it this way, we've slain the dragon, but we now live in a jungle. We now live in a jungle inhabited by poisonous snakes. And in a sense, although you have the rise of the new so-called threats from China and Russia, that old idea is still very much with us. But interestingly, it sometimes goes wider than that. We talked a bit about the integrated review on defense development and foreign policy. Just about 3 weeks ago, a study was published by the US Office of the Director for National Intelligence, and that's one of the very big agencies of which you hear rather less. The director has a particular mini think tank, and it produces a statement on global trends every 4 years. It's just published a new one. It's called Global Trends, subtitle, A More Contested World. The Washington Post said it's fascinating and described it as a world unsettled by the coronavirus pandemic, the ravages of climate change, which will propel mass migration, and a widening gap between what people want and governments can deliver. And when you look at the report, it deals with economic issues in these sorts of terms, forecasting, quotes, a more fragmented trading environment, rising governmental debt, employment challenges, and increasing corporate power at the state level. It also focuses particularly on, quotes, the more strained relationships between societies and their governments, as if accentuating the recent rise of diverse political populisms. Now, you don't get anything like that depth of analysis in our own review. And in many ways, at first sight, people will say, well, that's actually interesting. And that sort of strikes a chord. It's talking about things which don't figure much in British government thinking, which, as Tariq said so clearly, is very much couched in this idea of reclaiming a kind of imperial role. You know, there's this comment which I think is really there, that France and Britain both have these delusions of post-imperial grandeur. And by chance, they're the two countries that both have nuclear forces, which they certainly don't remotely need, and they also have big aircraft carriers to show the flag worldwide. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at the American study, there are two things which are massively and very obviously missing. It doesn't recognize that the underlying problem for so much of this, when you're talking about the economic issues of the rest, is that you have the dominant neoliberal economic culture, which is enhancing a yet more divided and marginalized society. And that's at the root of so many of the problems we face. It is beginning to recognize some of the other elements, particularly its concentration on climate breakdown, but it doesn't see it in the wider context. And then there is the much wider issue, which again has been touched on already, that you're dealing with what, interestingly, Eisenhower popularized as a phrase all those years ago, the military-industrial complex, or as some people say, the military-industrial academic bureaucratic complex. Now this entity, this part of national cultures, the bigger it is, coincides with how large the military of a country is, but it's present to an extent in virtually every country. It's embedded in an attitude which basically sees recourse to power and the use of power is the main way forward. That, in fact, is almost the first thing. And as Tariq was saying, the extraordinary thing is this is in spite of the failures. Now, he's mentioned in particular Afghanistan, and we're seeing that sort of unframe almost in front of our eyes. But he mentioned the others like Yemen and Iraq. The most significant one, I think, for the future is actually the fourth of the failed wars, which we rarely talk about. That is the failed air war against ISIS. And remember, that was incredibly intense between 2014 and 16. It continued for another 2 years, and it's still going on. Last month, the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force, and I think probably French aircraft, were involved in about 130 attacks against ISIS units in Iraq and Syria. Now, virtually none of that was reported outside the military literature. And the point is, this whole move towards remote warfare is, in a sense, sort of covering up what's really continuing. Now, I've no doubt at all that Biden will do his best to withdraw most of the troops from Afghanistan. He may well succeed fully. There will be privatized elements left, but most of the Americans will have gone. But the capability to intervene will not have gone. And essentially, if from the American perspective things get out of hand, then there will be plenty of forces available pretty close to the country in terms of drones, strike aircraft and the rest to intervene. The American presence in Iraq numbers what, probably 2,000, and they're mostly in training roles. But you have planes from aircraft carriers, from bases in Kuwait, Jordan, elsewhere, the British places at Akrotiri, in Cyprus, all able to continue the process. And it's in this kind of way that it goes on, just as France is fighting this long-term war in the Sahel. No, ISIS was not, quote, defeated in the conventional sense. And that kind of paramilitary movement is now almost rampant across much of the Sahel. It goes on, but it goes on in the quiet. And this, I think, is one of the most important things that we have to recognize. This is a long-term problem, and it breaks out in different ways. At the root of it, obviously, is coming to terms with the failed economic paradigm, the fact that while we're beginning to get to grips with climate breakdown, we have a very long way to go. And also we have to rethink security because the military-industrial complex is simply not fit for purpose. What else can you say about this at the moment? Well, one of the issues here, and it's been touched on already, the use of the Union flag and the rest, is that this perception that Great Britain, the term great, relates to a kind of imperial past and a kind of quasi-imperial future. That has to be, in a sense, reinvented and redeveloped. And there are very easy ways of doing this, and so much of it, in fact, was in Jeremy's Geneva speech of, what, 3 or 4 years ago. And if you've not read that, you should go back and read that, because that really paints a very different picture of the kind of role a country like Britain could play. I certainly would go along with the people who are now arguing that one of the things you do as a starting point is decrease military spending in Britain by 10% a year for 10 years. With reverse compound interest, that takes you down to about 40% to what you have now. But you reconfigure the forces. You put far more effort into UN peacekeeping. You put far more effort, away more from the military, into conflict prevention in all its different forms. Where you have military forces, they're geared for 2 roles. They can do humanitarian work when push comes to shove very urgently, effectively. And they can do peacekeeping as well. The other roles really are incidental given the sorts of faces we need, the forces we need in the future. As has been said, you can't nuke a virus and you can't use nuclear weapons to defeat climate breakdown. These are completely different sorts of security threats, and they're the ones that face us, the important ones. And probably more important than anything else is the critical need nationally to rethink what we mean by security. Some think tanks are doing this. Rethinkingsecurity.org, I think, is probably the best at the present time. There's a lot of very good work going on in different areas, critiquing the neoliberal economy and critiquing and putting forward better ideas for the kind of response we have to environmental issues. In some ways, we're in a hugely important time. It's a time of change. And I love that definition of prophecy, where prophecy is said to be merely basically envisaging, almost envisaging the possible, determining the possible, thinking through the possible. Because that has to be the role for people like us. In addition to the campaigning, we have to work out what are the best ways forward and how we can adopt them. If we can do that, then we can provide a degree of something which is so missing in all of that, and that is hope. So basically, prophecy as suggesting the possible. That's one of the things that we have to do. And there's so much more, but that at least is a starter. Thanks so much, Shelley.
Thank you, Paul. That's fantastic. I mentioned at the start that this year marks 20 years since this campaign, Stop the War Coalition, was founded. And just so that everybody's kind of aware, we're going to be marking that with some events later on in the year. And please do think about what you could be doing locally in your groups as well to mark that anniversary. Our next speaker is an anti-racist and community activist turned Member of Parliament. She represents the Leicester East constituency and she's a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs. She's been a fantastic supporter of Stop the War over the years, so it's a real pleasure to be joined by Claudia Webb.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's my name is Claudia Webb. I'm the Member of Parliament for Leicester East. And it's a pleasure to join you all today and to speak alongside such an inspiring panel. And I would just like to start by really thanking Stop the War, not only for organising today's fantastic event, but also for all the work they do in service of peace and global justice. 10 years ago, in March 2011, only 2% of the House of Commons voted against intervention in Libya, just 13 MPs. This tiny minority, which included Jeremy Corbyn, of course, have been gravely vindicated over the last 10 years. This war has led to more misery, tragedy, and heartbreak for the Libyan people. The war is commonly understood as a disaster, and it shows the importance of speaking up against war and for peace, internationalism and justice, even when the establishment and their media try to squeeze out our voices. We also know from WikiLeaks cables that the motive for invading Libya was not the hollow humanitarian rhetoric heard in the House of Commons, but rather the neo-colonial desire to install a regime that better served the strategic interest of Western countries, as well as the extraction of oil and gas from North Africa. The Libyan bombing campaign demonstrated that the British establishment had learnt nothing from the illegal invasion of Iraq, especially that Western intervention and regime change only serve to create power vacuums that exacerbate the suffering of people in the surrounding regions. The racism and Islamophobia of these military interventions cannot be ignored. Neither can the enduring legacy of the British Empire, which carved up the region and left a legacy of instability that persists to this day. The Iraq, Afghanistan and Libyan interventions must be seen in this historical context, in which Britain still believes it can act with impunity in a region from which they have violently extracted an obscene amount of resources over the centuries. You know, I was elected on a manifesto which pledged to end the bomb first talk later approach. And this approach to international security was what I committed to. Limit the war powers of the executive, and conduct an audit of the impact of Britain's colonial legacy so that we can fully expose the British contribution to the violence and insecurity across regions previously under British colonial rule. You see, this last policy is incredibly important, as this year we have seen an appalling resurgence of the demonisation of refugees and asylum seekers. Yet asylum seekers arriving in Britain are often from countries where the UK has contributed to their disruption, either by arming current conflicts or through the enduring legacy of colonialism. The time has come for former empires to take seriously the historical debt that they owe to the countries, communities, and individuals who endured their cruelty. As internationalists, it is therefore crucial that we defend the anti-war policy programme developed over the last 5 years. And for many of us, we'd hoped that the unprecedented pandemic would provide a unique opportunity for peace. Yet, there are currently thousands of British forces in at least 35 countries around the world, including 1,000 in Afghanistan and more than 1,000 in the Middle East. Their continued presence in these areas is only serving to prolong conflict and heighten tensions. For instance, in Yemen, as we've heard, the conflict has spiked during the pandemic. The UK, alongside the US, supplies weapons and, crucially, military support to the Saudi-led coalition, which is responsible for the highest number of reported civilian fatalities. The death toll in the war in Yemen passed 100,000 just last year. The Yemeni conflict is one of the worst humanitarian crises of the modern era. It is shameful that Britain remains complicit in such an atrocity, especially as the US has signalled that US support for Saudi-led coalition will end. But of course, we cannot have hope in a regime change, if you like, in the US, because we've already seen US airstrike in Syria, a firm commitment to uphold illegal sanctions on Venezuela aimed at regime change. And this is within just a few months of Joe Biden coming to office. Issues of Islamophobia and racism, again, must be recognised in the Yemeni conflict. It is unimaginable that suffering on the scale seen in Yemen would be permitted by the international community to take place in a majority white country. The coronavirus outbreaks offered our government, the British government, a unique opportunity to step away from the conflict, as well as other theatres of war, which caused so much suffering across the globe, yet our government refused to take it. Although the UK backed the UN's global ceasefire proposal, there is no evidence of any action being taken on the ground, with the RAF continuing to fly troops around the world. From this pandemic to the existential threat of climate change, the global community is facing increasingly common enemies that cannot be solved by warmongering and belligerence. The government must be true to its word and draw up a plan to withdraw troops from war zones, as well as reconsider its recent hike in the military budget. And this brings me to some final conclusions. That in this time of a global pandemic, it is time that we come together to loudly say, time has come for our government to stop spending so much money on weapons of war and destruction, including nuclear weapons, and instead spend it on keeping us secure by tackling the pandemic, climate change, and the other crises we face. From this pandemic to the existential threat of climate change, the global community is facing those increasingly common enemies. All of us on the left must therefore use our voice, of course, to ensure that we are a force for peace and justice across the globe. And, you know, I'm incredibly proud to represent an incredibly diverse area, community, constituency of Leicester East, where we have a significant number of residents who are Muslim. And I'm fortunate to experience firsthand the many, many important ways in which the Islamic community contributes to our collective religious, cultural and political life. But we're in a time when the actions abroad have caused a huge increase in hate crime. It's more than doubled since 2013 as records signify. And it's never been therefore more important for our communities to come together and unite. We must oppose Islamophobia, racism, and any attempt to divide us up based on nationality or religion, whether at home or abroad. A better world is absolutely possible. And I believe that the sterling work of Stop the War, its endurance over the past 20 years, its historic ability to unite and bring us all together will enable us all to ensure that not only is a better world possible, that we collectively together can make it happen. Solidarity, my friends, solidarity.
Thank you, Claudia. And I think, if we were all in a room, we'd all be applauding you right now. Some really important points there around Britain's complicity in the war in Yemen, the effects of racism that is created by this so-called war on terror. There's a session, one of the breakout sessions is looking at that specifically after this as well. And of course, the foolishness of thinking that this regime change in the US means that there'll be a more peaceful foreign policy. There's a session on Biden as well and what that means for global peace and justice. Our final speaker in this plenary is activist, academic, a patron of Stop the War, but of course he is most of all known for his music. It's great to have you here. Finalising this plenary, thank you, Lowkey.
Thank you very much, Shelley. It's great to be here. It is important that we emphasise at this point that not only was the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror a war of revenge, it was also a war of choice. In October 2001, the Taliban, through the Pakistani state acting as a middleman, offered Osama bin Laden to the United States. However, Bush refused the offer and went ahead with a war which has cost over $6.4 trillion over a period that is longer than World War I and World War II put together. It has entailed on average 46 bombs being dropped per day by the United States and their allies for 20 years and has displaced 37 million people. The war in Afghanistan alone has cost $2.2 trillion and around 250,000 lives. Let's not forget, when we talk about beneficiaries of this war, that 6 senior executives from Lockheed Martin, the company that has provided many of weapons for these wars, those 6 executives populated the George Bush administration. And in the same year that the war on terror was launched, Lockheed Martin got one of the biggest military contracts in the history of the United States. When we talk about US withdrawal, let's not forget that the Defense Department put out a statement at the beginning of this year saying that there were 18,000 private military contractors from the United States still in Afghanistan. What will happen to those contractors? That has not been made clear by the Biden administration. Even across the last few years alone, US counterterrorism operations have reached 85 countries. The US war on terror gave us Guantanamo Bay, where nobody was charged or convicted of any crime ever. And as WikiLeaks have revealed, that 2 of the people that were detained there were detained initially as 13-year-old children. We cannot forget that one of the youngest prisoners at Guantanamo Bay was a 17-year-old by the name of Yasser Talal al-Zahrani, who killed himself in his cell at the age of 21 years old. The International Criminal Court has found that there is reasonable basis to believe that the British Army has committed war crimes across this war on terror. And BAE Systems, who have profited handsomely off of this entire process, alone from the Saudi campaign in Yemen, have sold 17.6 billion pounds worth of arms. This was a war that at the back end of the war on terror has led to the greatest humanitarian crisis that we have seen in a long time, but that exists today. Tens of thousands of people have died from starvation, and huge swaths of the population are in deep danger as we speak. We know that even following the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the British government, through their trade minister, Liam Fox, was falling over themselves to make sure that they could continue BAE Systems sales to the Saudi government. As Mark Curtis has documented over the last few years, Britain has been involved in 7 different covert wars, from Syria to Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya to Yemen to Pakistan and Somalia. Another poison and bitter fruit of the war on terror has been the militarization of British society. We have now 275 schools across the country that host combined cadet forces and work on militarizing the children of tomorrow. Hidden in the Afghan withdrawal announcement was Lloyd Austin putting forth that the US would reverse the planned 12,000 troop reduction proposed by Trump, and in fact increase the amount of troops present in Germany, US soldiers present in Germany, by 500. This is clearly about pivoting towards Russia. Now, the UK itself has 140 military bases in 42 countries around the world, not least in 5 countries around China. China is surrounded by 400 US military bases, and we see daily the astroturfing of anti-Chinese ideas in British media and US media sources. But let's not forget that we on this side are not the international community. We are isolated. Even within the Five Eyes network, governments which facilitate the United States spying on their own citizens, Australia is the largest trading partner with China. Brazil, who had an unprecedented close relationship with the United States under Bolsonaro, are now the largest trading partner. Their largest trading partner is China. Even in India, where the army under Modi really were vulnerable to being used by the United States against China, their largest trading partner is China. It's not only the world's second largest importer, but it knocked the United States, after over 100 years of being the world's largest exporter, off of that place. And it is for that reason that the Chinese economy is very quickly overtaking the United States. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, which put forth the idea of China investing in around 70 countries. The China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank has actually carried out more loans in what we know as the Global South than the World Bank has. That key instrument of US foreign policy is waning in its influence on the Global South. We look at the 16+1 initiative that China has launched with Central and Eastern European states. 11 of those states involved in the 16+1 are EU member states. 4 of them are EU candidate countries. Greece and Italy are both getting closer to China. The United States and Britain, in their campaign to escalate hostilities towards China, would do well to remember the 56,000 US soldiers who died in Korea and the 58,000 US soldiers who died in Vietnam. One of the key attack lines which is being used to aim at China, as we saw the insufferable Emma Barnett on Newsnight this week putting it forward, is climate change. But let's not forget that 40% of China's energy consumption is for Western goods that are manufactured there. And in fact, between the mid 1700s and 2016, despite China being 18% of the world's population, they were responsible for 13% of emissions, whereas the United States, with only 4.2% of the world's population, was responsible for almost 30% of emissions. The United States, the United Kingdom, is only 0.8% of global population, but it is believed to be responsible for 5% of global emissions. If you look at per person, in the United States, 19.8 tons of carbon are produced per person, whereas in China, it is only 4.6 tons of carbon dioxide per person. So what we actually see is a situation where climate change is being put on the shoulders and in fact used to deepen war propaganda in that way. When we look at what Boris Johnson set out in his the end of the era of retreat, as he referred to it, you know, Britain's participation as the United States' junior partner in the war on terror could not be described as an era of retreat to most of us, but to him it was. So an overall increase in British military budget over a 4-year period of £24.1 billion. And Johnson made clear that over the next 4 years, that would be military spending of almost £200 billion. Now, when that was announced, the very next day, BAE Systems stock rose by 3%. Now, despite the largesse which is afforded to BAE Systems by the British state, it only represents 0.6% of Britain's GDP. But it is here that we arrive to the crux of the matter. The UK military and the arms companies involved with it are known to produce more carbon emissions than 60 individual countries. Now, Boris Johnson announced that they would look to bring forward the ban on new fossil fuel vehicles from 2040 to 2030. Well, then how do you explain pumping billions and billions of pounds into the very institution and the industries and companies which are responsible for so much climate change? Now, when he announced the bid to increase Trident, Lockheed Martin's stock rose by over 2% the day following it. Now, surveys show that 77% of the British public support a ban on nuclear weapons. How can you square that circle that you are doing something which is clearly against the will of the vast majority of the population? If we compare the amount of money being spent on military spending to how much the British government spends on the Environment Agency, then we have an annual budget of 0.13% of the government's annual spending goes on the Environment Agency, which has faced, prior to the pandemic, cuts of 40%. Now, that is an agency which supposedly regulates over 1 million businesses in the UK, but only employs about 1,000 people. Now, London alone, it is believed that you see 9,500 deaths a year from pollution. How is this imbalance justifiable? Research has found that, in fact, for every $1 billion that is invested in the arms industry, you only produce 11,200 jobs. When you compare that to something like clean energy, it's been found that every $1 billion invested in it creates 16,800 jobs. In healthcare, it produces that same $1 billion, 17,200 jobs. And in education, you see that $1 billion leading to 26,700 jobs. So in fact, the arms trade is not that great protector of British jobs that it is being depicted to be. We live through a period where 3 lockdowns in this country, you have had 1.4 million people survive through it with no recourse to public funds. In March 2020, there were 1.4 million people seeking job seekers allowance or universal credit. A year later, you have 2.6 million people seeking those things. Almost 1,000 homeless people across 2020 died in this country. We have far more important and better things and more socially useful things to spend money on than more toys for us to audition as the US's junior partner in more of its war games. The Spy Cops bill was put forward to give impunity domestically. The Overseas Forces bill was put forward to give impunity abroad. And the way that that unaccountability of the military state is buttressed is through the D-Notice Committee, which formerly was known as the DSMA Committee. It's where journalists go along and talk to civil servants, and the civil servants tell them dutifully what they would prefer they don't report. And in a lot of cases, in fact, the vast majority of cases, journalists do as they are told. They play a game of servility for access in order for the system to keep reproducing itself. But there is a lesson from history that we must force them to remember. Anti-war actors in this country have been victorious several times. We were victorious when Bertrand Russell got the death penalties applied to 34 conscientious objectors commuted during World War I. We were victorious when dock workers refused to load weapons onto the SS Jolly George to be sent to Russia to aid the British in their invasion of Russia after the revolution. We were victorious when the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign stopped Britain from joining the Americans in the Vietnam War in a meaningful way. We were victorious after an 11-year struggle at Greenham Common. It was the home to 96 nuclear missiles. And the Ministry of Defense said before those missiles were transported that they would quietly melt into the countryside. 11 years, women struggled at Greenham Common, cut their way into the base and disrupted this basis of power. Now, the last missiles left that base in 1991. Today, that base is not there and the weapons are not there anymore. But what is there is a plaque which commemorates those protesters at Greenham Common and commemorates it as a historic site. That is the poetic justice in which we play a vital part. Now, the son of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was responsible for the Panama Papers and was assassinated in a car bomb after that, said that the best way we can protect whistleblowers is to act on what they reveal. Now, the war on terror has produced many whistleblowers who have been martyred for what they have done. Our job is to act on the information that they reveal and stop future wars like the war on terror, costing lives of millions of people across the planet.
Thank you so much, Lowkey, and what a great bit to end on there with some examples of the victories of the anti-war movement. Now it's everybody's chance to head out into those breakout sessions, but we are having a short break, so those will be starting at 3:30. So you've got a little bit of time to get yourself a bite to eat or a drink. You'll be able to join those breakout sessions. At the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says Breakout Rooms, and they will be appearing on there. I'll just recap the options that you've got. We have got Britain's role in the Middle East. We've got Biden and the conflict with China. We've got Final Frontiers, Arms Trade, Space Wars and Artificial Intelligence. racism and Islamophobia, and war and climate change. So please do go along, take those questions into those discussions, and I will see you back here in the main room at the end of it. And also just a note to say, the Biden and the conflict with China one, that will actually be taking place here in the main room, so you don't need to go anywhere if that's the session that you want to join. Thank you very much to all our speakers. It's been incredibly interesting, incredibly inspiring. I've learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to going into those breakout rooms now and having a chat with people. Thanks once again, and thank you all for joining. See you later.